10 a.m., Moscow, December 27th. The biggest New Year's festival on Earth didn't lose power. It got erased. One moment, VDNKh was a $100 million neon flex, an electric winter empire glowing through the freezing air like a Russian Disneyland. The next moment, it became a black silhouette, a dead outline, a frozen monument to embarrassment, standing in the dark under a brutal sky. And here's the part that should make every military planner sit up straight. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't aging infrastructure. This wasn't a local outage. This was a message. Because Kyiv just proved something that Moscow hates admitting out loud. If you mess with Ukraine's light switches, they won't just flip yours back. They'll reach into the strategic power supply and pull the plug on your myth. So how did a propaganda mega project go dark in one heartbeat? To understand that, you have to understand what VDNKh actually is, especially in late December. Because VDNKh isn't just a festival, it's an emotion, a stage, a national reassurance ritual. It's where the Kremlin goes to tell the public everything is fine, while the war burns men, vehicles, and budgets hundreds of miles away. It's got a skating rink so massive it's basically a frozen stadium, roughly twice the size of an NFL field. It has a New Year's tree so tall it might as well be a lighthouse for state pride. Giant LED walls pump out images of Russian strength, heroic montages, fireworks, smiles, unity. The purpose isn't entertainment. The purpose is psychological. It's the perfect set design for a fairy tale meant to drown out reality. But on this night, the real holiday special wasn't happening on the ice. It was happening 20 miles northeast. Deep inside the snow-heavy brush of Losiny Ostrov National Park, Moscow's so-called Green Lung, a six-man team from Ukraine's military intelligence service, the GUR, was operating in absolute silence. No lights, no radio chatter, no mistakes, and they weren't praying for a miracle. They were building one, out of math, terrain, and controlled chaos. Here's the twist that makes this story so dangerous. They didn't bring stealth jets. They didn't bring cruise missiles. They didn't bring anything that screams major power. They brought two Dovbush T-10s. If you've never heard that name, don't worry. Most Russians probably hadn't either. And that's exactly the problem. Think of the Dovbush T-10 as an aerial aircraft carrier, built by people who grew up turning broken machines into monsters. A 150-pound composite beast, a wingspan around 12 meters, a carbon fiber body, not just light, but deliberately shaped to look like something else on radar. Its signature? A big bird. That matters, because Russian sensors are tuned to hunt metal aircraft. Heavy, loud, obvious targets, not something that looks like wildlife sliding through clutter. And hidden under each mothership's wings was the real payload. 6 Wasp FPV drones per T-10, 12 total. Small, fast, disposable, yet lethal. And they weren't headed toward a military parade ground or a random apartment block. They were headed for the power heart that kept the illusion alive. Now pause for a second and picture what they're attempting. Moscow is ringed with Pantsir S-1 systems, billion-dollar air defense monsters that can track hundreds of targets and fire Mach 4 interceptors at anything that moves wrong. To most militaries, sending drones into that net is a suicide mission. But Moscow had already taken drone hits before. And to the GUR, this wasn't a "can we do it" question. It was a probability equation, a puzzle with a satisfying solution. By around 10 p.m., the launch rail was armed. No theatrics, no bravado, just the soft mechanical clicks of the catapult locking into position. The plan was built on one ruthless idea: fly low, ride the Yaouza River at around 200 feet, exploit ground clutter, bridges, power lines, skyscrapers, towers, where radar returns become messy noise, and hope the Pantsir operators were distracted by holiday celebrations, fatigue, or the cognitive overload of a city that never stops blinking. Then, the first Dovbush T-10 launched, and the New Year's nightmare officially began. As it crossed the 20-mile mark from central Moscow, the electronic landscape snapped into panic. Russian crews saw something on their screens. But not the mothership. What they saw looked worse. A swarm, a cloud, a chaotic incoming wave. Because Ukrainian operators had launched dozens of decoy drones, literal cardboard gliders fitted with tiny reflectors designed to mimic the radar signature of cruise missiles. To the Pantsir's radar, especially the one RS-2E, the sky suddenly looked like a massive incoming strike package. And that's where the billion-dollar math starts to fail. The Pantsir is terrifying, but it has limitations. It carries 12 missiles. 12. Against a sky full of targets, that's nothing. So what did panicked operators do? They started ripple firing. 57 E-6 missiles streaked upward, each shot costing roughly $1 million. $1 million per shot. And what were they blowing up? Cardboard, paper, cheap decoys. It's like using a Ferrari to flatten a plastic bag. Yes, the bag is gone, but you're the one destroying yourself. And while Pantsir batteries were busy spending fortunes to erase toys, the first Dovbush T-10 did what it was built to do. It dropped lower, down to around 150 feet, hugging the curves of the Yauza River like it was glued to the surface of the city, below radar horizons, blending into clutter, vanishing inside the noise, a ghost in the machine. Then it reached the release line, and the air over Moscow turned into a real engagement zone. Mothership 1 released its 6 Wasps, and instantly the sky lit up with white-hot tracer fire. A Pantsir unit stationed on a rooftop finally bypassed the decoy chaos and engaged with its twin 2 A38M 30mm autocannons. 2 barrels, massive rate of fire, high explosive incendiary shells ripping the air apart. Wasp 1 didn't survive the first lesson. It was caught in a concentrated burst and shattered into a glittering cloud of plastic, carbon, and lithium. 1 down. The remaining 5 reacted like hunted animals. They dove low, below rooflines, between apartment blocks, weaving through narrow corridors where radar locks struggle. But Moscow didn't rely on just high tech. It used brute force. Security teams on roofs, factory roofs, building roofs, opened up with AK-74 fire, pouring rounds into the sky like a flat curtain made of lead. Wasp 2 took a 5.45mm round directly into its rear motor. The drone spun violently, unrecoverably, slammed into a huge Happy New Year billboard, and exploded in a useless ball of fire. 2 down. Then came the electronic nightmare. Russian jamming began painting the drone's sensors with ghosts. False heat signatures, distorted thermal shapes, visual noise. Wasp 3 got baited by the heat signature of an industrial chimney and mistook it for the transformer station. It slammed into brickwork. All that sacrifice for a scorched smear on a wall. 3 down. At this point, the mission was right on the edge of humiliation. Half the wave destroyed, the survivors flying into a storm of fire, noise, and confusion. But this is where Ukrainian operators show why drone warfare isn't just about hardware. It's about psychology. They used the smoke from the first crashes as a screen. Wasps 4 and 5 pulled aggressive high-G maneuvers, yanking the defenders' aim away for seconds. 2 seconds. That was the only opening they needed. Because Wasp 6 wasn't just another drone. It was the finisher. It screamed over the substation perimeter fence at around 130 miles per hour, locked its onboard targeting onto the main 20-kilovolt bus bar, and dove. Impact. The shaped charge fired. A jet of molten copper punched into the transformer's heart, and the Moscow sky lit up with a sapphire blue electrical arc, a power flash visible for miles, like the city itself screaming. But the substation was massive. One hit wouldn't kill the festival. And that's the cruelest part. At that moment, Russian defenders thought they'd won. On their screens, the threat looked neutralized. 4 out of 6 down. 1 hit landed. Damage looked manageable. Engineers could patch it in an hour. A minor technical issue. To the propaganda machine, it was almost perfect. They could spin this into a victory story. Heroic Pantsir crews defend Moscow from Ukrainian provocation. But 10 minutes behind that chaos, the second Dovbush T-10 arrived. And this was never meant to be a single strike. This was a double tap designed to exploit the reload gap. Because the Pantsir S1 has a deadly weakness. Once it fires its 12 missiles, it's out of the missile fight for at least 5 minutes, while a loader vehicle manually cranes new tubes onto the rails. And those autocannons? They have a duty cycle. After dumping thousands of rounds against decoys and drones, the barrels overheat. They glow cherry red, keep firing, and the rifling warps, turning precision into spray. So just as crews were climbing out of cabins to vent heat, Mothership 2 crested from a different vector, the northwest. A fresh angle, a fresh problem. It released 6 Wasps at about 8 miles, and Moscow's defenders went from victory party to total panic in 15 seconds. But this time, Moscow had something waiting. An elite Rosgvardia unit, tipped off by the first strike, had scrambled a mobile Krasuka 4 electronic warfare truck to a bridge overlooking the Yauza River. This wasn't casual jamming. This was an electronic wall. They flooded the 2.4 GHz and 5.8 GHz bands with a thick white noise blast around 500 watts, designed to blind FPV systems and drown out control links. Wasp 7 hit the wall and went blind instantly. Its feed turned to static. Without a pilot hand, it drifted, lazy, helpless, into a residential high-rise and exploded harmlessly against a concrete balcony. At the same time, Wasp 8 got hit in a different way. A Russian soldier on a factory roof aimed an EDM-4S Skywiper handheld jammer. A classic duel, roughly $15,000 of handheld electronic warfare versus an $8,000 drone. The jammer won. The flight controller glitched. The drone nosedived into the frozen river and disappeared. Russian commanders felt control returning. But they forgot the single most dangerous thing about Ukrainian drone warfare. Ukraine adapts fast. Ukrainian engineers live in firmware updates. The remaining 4 Wasps triggered their Deadman AI. This is the part that changes everything. When all external signals go flat, GPS, radio, Starlink, everything, these drones don't give up. They switch brains. They stop trying to talk to operators. Instead, their onboard processors begin running visual odometry, comparing the high-contrast lights and street patterns of Moscow against a preloaded 3D digital twin of the city. They were essentially reading Moscow like a human reads a map. You can jam airwaves. You can't jam geometry. When Russia realized the drones weren't stopping, panic deepened. In a desperate move, they activated a hidden TOR M2 system held in reserve near the Kremlin. The TOR is faster and more accurate than Pantsir, a final boss. It fired 2 missiles, 9M331 interceptors. Wasp 9 tried a desperate 9G evasive maneuver. It didn't matter. The proximity fuse detonated about 20 feet away and shredded the drone with tungsten fragments. Now the odds were brutal. 3 drones left, 1 substation, 1 target that had to be hit correctly, because near enough doesn't count against power infrastructure. Then Wasp 10 became the sacrificial lamb. It climbed to 500 feet, making itself a massive glowing target on TOR radar. The operator took the bait. He fired his last ready missile. Wasp 10 vanished in the air, but it bought the final 2 drones something priceless: 11 seconds of silent flight time. Wasps 11 and 12 were now inside 500 yards. They weren't just flying, they were screaming. They locked thermal sensors onto the primary transformer's cooling manifold, a target the size of a pizza box surrounded by fences, lights, and defenders. And on the ground, Russians threw everything upward: a K-74s, PKM machine guns, random bursts from whoever had a weapon, even a flare gun. It was a wall of lead. Wasp 11 took a bullet through its battery pack and caught fire, but momentum carried it forward. It didn't strike the bus bars. Instead, it slammed into the backup generator's fuel tank. And that mattered, because a massive orange fireball erupted, instantly filling the area with smoke and confusion. And behind that smoke, Wasp 12 emerged, 4% battery left, front left motor vibrating from a near miss. But the AI didn't care about damage. It saw the transformer. It identified the sweet spot where oil lines entered the pressurized casing. And it initiated a terminal dive at around 140 miles per hour. Impact. The 2-pound-shaped charge detonated in -4-degree cold. The physics were savage. The molten copper jet didn't just pierce the transformer, it caused a bolted fault, catastrophically bridging the high-voltage windings to the grounded steel tank. Inside the substation, the sound wasn't a single explosion. It was a thunderclap that refused to end. 70 tons of mineral oil superheated to roughly 3,000 degrees in a microscopic instant. Pressure relief valves vaporized, and a sapphire blue arc of electricity, about 100 feet long, shot into the sky, turning the Moscow night into artificial daylight for 5 terrifying seconds. Back at VDNKh, the Everything is Fine show finally met reality. The sapphire light reflected off the ice rink like an omen. And then came the sound Moscow never wanted to hear. Regional circuit breakers detonating as the power surge ripped backward through the grid. The fairy lights didn't just dim, they surged with blinding final brilliance. And then their filaments melted. The towering New Year's tree flickered like a dying star. Then came absolute soul-crushing darkness. Music died mid-note. Giant LED screens, moments ago showing Russian military glory, went black. In -4-degree cold, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the weight of realization. Ukraine hadn't just hit a transformer. They had dismantled the Kremlin's Fortress Moscow myth with roughly $60,000 of garage genius tech and a long memory. The hunters had become the hunted, and the most expensive party in Russia was suddenly over. Of course, Russia's Ministry of Defense scrambled to call it a minor technical glitch. But satellites don't care about press releases. NASA's fire tracking systems showed something different, a massive thermal spike at the heart of Moscow's power infrastructure. And the exchange rate on this fight? It was humiliating. Ukraine's mission cost roughly $60,000, the price of 2 Dovbush motherships and a dozen FPV drones. In return, they neutralized a multi-million-dollar transformer substation that could take months to fully repair, especially with Western sanctions choking access to specialized high-voltage components. But that's only the first layer of damage, because Russia also spent massively to defend. At least 15 Pantsir and TOR missiles were fired during the engagement. At roughly $1 million per interceptor, Moscow burned something like $15 million to shoot at cardboard decoys and garage-built drones, and they still lost the target. That isn't just a tactical loss. That's a psychological defeat. Because in Russia, New Year's isn't just a holiday. It's the most important cultural event of the year, a national ritual of state-mandated optimism, a reset button for public mood. And by casting VDNKh into total darkness, Ukraine didn't just strike a transformer. They hit the public's sense of safety. They hit the myth. They hit the idea that Moscow is untouchable. Fortress Moscow, dead. Cold reality replaced the "everything is fine" glow, and the symbolism was brutally symmetrical, a stark reminder that you can't weaponize winter against millions of Ukrainian families and expect your own festive lights to stay on forever. What the world witnessed was the Dovbush Wasp doctrine in motion. A modern David versus Goliath evolution where AI-guided garage tech, clever mothership tactics, and deception can systematically dismantle a billion-dollar defense grid. Because modern war isn't about who has the biggest missile. It's about who has the smartest algorithm, who has the most creative engineers, who can turn cheap hardware into strategic leverage. And Ukraine just showed they aren't only fighting for territory, they're fighting for the right to return every blow with interest. So here's the real question for the armchair generals watching this unfold. If you were commanding this drone unit, and you knew Russia is now dragging more and more of its remaining defense systems back to Moscow, where would you strike next? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Bye for now.